Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. In this session, which is the second session pertaining to Muslim, non-Muslim relations, we wanted to return back to the topic given its importance, and we wanted to reorient ourselves and represent the idea before moving on. One of the things that I encountered in the pamphlet Muslim Non-Muslim Relations by Dr. Jamal Badawi, which forced me to revisit the topic and to reintroduce it, it was the way that it was presented. And the presentation can lead to some lack of clarity. So I wanted to reintroduce the ideas because he does put forward some ideas which are extremely important for us that are living in what we call pluralistic societies. And I wanted to define that term because I know last time when I introduced the idea, I didn't define it. Pluralism, and even in Arabic, we talk about the issue of ta'addud, yani ta'addud al-ahzab, or for instance, pluralism in political parties. But in political science, pluralism means that society which has a lot of different cultural groups, and it has different religions and even different ideas of politics. But in the context that Dr. Jamal Badawi is writing, when he talks about pluralism, he's talking about how us as Muslims, how is it that we deal with people of other religions, and more specifically, how is it that we deal with the people of the book. I wanted to add onto the idea that Dr. Jamal Badawi brings to us with regard to Muslim, non-Muslim relations. What is that idea? That idea is that he says that there's 10 principles that the Quran presents to us that govern the relationship between the Muslim and the non-Muslim. I wanted to add to that idea a concept that Dr. Ahmed Zeki, from the scholars of Al-Azhar, and he has been living in North America for a number of years, and he's excellent in his presentation of English. And the same thing with Dr. Jamal Badawi. Dr. Jamal Badawi is known to many of us as being one of the pioneers of Dawah in North America. And he had contributed to the dialogue between Christians and Muslims for a very long time. And he has served as a model of Dawah for decades in North America. But let's come to this point and reflect upon it with regard to the Quran that Dr. Ahmed Zeki, who is actually a translator of the Quran into the English language and from the scholars of Al-Azhar, as I mentioned. Let's look at what he says before we get into the 10 principles that Dr. Jamal Badawi brings up with regard to how it is that we should understand our relationship to non-Muslims. Firstly, Dr. Ahmed Zeki, he says that the Quran has been revealed with a specific aim or goal or maqsad, and that is to liberate human beings from superstition and false assumptions with regard to God. So that's a foundational idea that governs our engagement in interfaith. That we have this idea that the Quran is coming to liberate us as Muslims, before we get into this mindset of that we liberate other people. First of all, us, the Quran gives us a platform. When we start talking about interfaith dialogue, before we start getting into the situation of how we relate to other people from other faiths, there's this idea that we ourselves as Muslims, the Quran is giving us a framework for how to think about God and to liberate us from superstition and false assumption. So that's a strong claim that the Quran is orienting us to have an understanding that human beings have made assumptions about God, which basically are ideas without foundation, without evidence, that can't be supported. And human beings have generated superstition, meaning these are ideas that they are problematic in and of themselves, and they can even be harmful to human beings because they push human beings into a certain mindset that don't allow the human being to fully operate rationally. Like, for instance, that thunder means that God is angry with us. Or if we see a bird that's black, that means that death is coming. Or if we see a cloud that's coming, we shouldn't leave our houses because something bad will take place. And so that type of superstitious thinking becomes that which controls our lives. And it limits our potential as human beings to even function or operate in the world in the way that Allah wants us to operate in the world. And that is that we're agents of Allah, we're deputies of Allah. We have a responsibility with the khulafa of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. Allah tabarak wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. So the human being has a distinctive role. That's something that we have to be clear about ourselves. The Quran teaches us that the human being has a distinctive role. So firstly, we have this idea that the Quran teaches us that there are assumptions and there is superstition with regard to who God is. And secondly, the Quran teaches us that the human being has a distinctive role. Okay, so then at this point, the Quran itself offers no compromise with the issue of idol worship and the issue of the practice of worshiping idols. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't treat people justly. That doesn't mean that we don't treat people fairly. That doesn't mean that we can't coexist with people. But when it comes to the issue of how it is that we engage ideas, on this point, we're clear that false assumptions and superstition is problematic for us. Now, that doesn't mean that we negate the humanity of other people, right? But at that point, when it comes to the issue of certain beliefs and practices as it pertains to Allah, we have to be clear that there's certain things which are problematic and certain things which are completely rejected, certain things that we just can't work through. So then, as far as the people of the book, the Quran itself gives a recognition and a preservation of their status, because we also have to understand that the people of the book, they were the guardians of faith. They all don't have the same classification or categorization. The Quran mandates belief in all of what was revealed, right? That preceded it as a precondition of faith. So part of our faith as Muslims is al-iman bil-kutub wa al-iman bil-rusul before that, which is belief in the books that were revealed and belief in the messengers. We believe that messengers and prophets have come to all of humanity. And messengers and prophets have come to all of humanity to teach about who God is. Even though they may have differed on certain details in which they guided their people in, overall, when it comes to who God is, there was unity between them, right? And so here, the Quran mandates the issue of belief in the revelation that was given to humanity in its different installations, whether it was the Torah or the Injil or the Zabur, as well as the Quran. Now, we have this understanding that the Quran has maintained itself in terms of the preservation of the Quran. So our belief in the books that came before is a general belief, and we acknowledge that there may be certain things that may still be true, but we acknowledge that there's some sort of distortion. And that's factual. Historically, we know that the Torah and the Injil were translated into other languages. There's no debate about that. There's no making that up. That's a historical fact. And we know that there are only fragments of the original books of the Bible that exist. And that's not to belittle the people of the book. These are scientific, historical, archaeological realities. And so the Quran itself gives the communities that formed around these revelations status and called them Ahl al-Kitab, right? And so these revelations, we acknowledge that they existed, and we acknowledge that there's a problem in preservation, but we, at the same time, do not discriminate in the sense that the Quran does not discriminate. You know what I'm saying? We find that the Quran disapproves of offensive to in matters of religion, whether it comes from Jews, whether it comes from Christians, whether it comes from Muslims. And the Quran even singles out the idea of hypocrisy or of nifaq, right? And specifically within the context of the Muslim community, right? Because of the lack of integrity. Lack of integrity means that what they believe in their hearts doesn't align with their actions. So in their actions, when we talk about nifaq, they present belief, but in their hearts they don't believe. And so the Quran itself is addressing that group within the Muslim community. But the Quran doesn't discriminate. If a Jew violates the worship of Allah, a Christian violates the worship of Allah, a Muslim violates the worship of Allah, all of them, are given address by the Quran and are called to correct themselves in their beliefs and in their practices. And so the people of the book were the guardians of faith. And so we acknowledge that reality. That they were the guardians of faith. And so that's the common ground that we have with them, although we have some points of difference. Now, let's go to where it is that we find the framework that allows us to deal with, especially in this society, the people of the book in more than just a formal way. Firstly, when we talk about Islam, the foundation in Islam, when we talk about the word Islam itself, it has to do with peace. And this is not something that is politically correct. We find that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in what is called the Constitution of Medina, he aimed to establish a relationship with those who lived in Jazirat al-Arab, from the Christians and the Jewish community, and he tried to go into a political pact with them. So the differences which had existed between the Muslims and the people of the book were acknowledged. Even when we look at Najashi, right? Najashi, when we look at, for instance, the Christians in parts of Africa, specifically Habasha, we look at the status that was given to that community by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the problems that occur at times between the Muslims and the people of the book in the early period is not because it's a fight between religions, because the reality at the end of the day is that the Quran lays out a framework for us for how it is that we're going to deal with differences in belief. The problems that occurred earlier on in the history of Islam between Muslims and the people of the book had a lot to do with their contractual relationships on the political level, the violation of those realities. And in those cases in which the people of the book violated the principles of Tawheed, the Quran called them to return back to Tawheed, to that which it is that they believed in, which is the oneness of God. And so the Quran acknowledges where there's soundness of faith in the foundation, whether it be the case of Christians, Jews, or Muslims. The Quran speaks to humanity as a whole, and even speaks to those that are idol worshippers that refuse to acknowledge who Allah is at a foundational level, right? Or give precedence to idols over Allah, right? In terms of their worship, they mix it, So the Quran addresses all of humanity and wants to elevate and liberate humanity from false assumption and unfounded opinions and superstition. So firstly, Salam then, the issue of Islam is about coexisting with others, coexisting not only with human beings, but coexisting with the creation itself, coming into a state of alignment with the will of God. And the will of God is that which teaches us how to function in the world. with the creation itself and with ourselves. That's the essence of Islam. The essence of Islam, it comes from the idea of peace and submission. From a spiritual perspective, Dr. Jamal Badawi talks about attainment of tranquility and peace by being in submission and in alignment with the command of Allah. I wanted to pause on this point. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim and many others, but I mention Imam Ibn al-Qayyim because it's easy to reference. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim is a scholar in Islam. He talked about how the reality of revelation is that revelation points out for us where there's benefit for human beings and where it is that there's harm. The reality of revelation itself in the world, in this existence that we live in on earth, its goal is to aid human beings in this journey through life that's temporary, because we know that the human being doesn't stay here for an eternity. So the issue of the worship of God is not because God needs that worship. The worship of God and the following of the will of Allah, or the following of the will of God and aligning with that will, is so that we become people of wisdom, become people that are wise and know how to put things in their place, and come to a point where we can identify that which is beneficial and differentiate or distinguish that which is beneficial from that which is harmful. So Islam, in this case, is a methodology for understanding how to determine what is beneficial for humanity and what is harmful. That's essential to understand. So in understanding what's beneficial for us and realizing, meaning in obtaining that which is beneficial or actually benefiting from that which is good, we gain a sense of peace in our relationship with ourselves, in our relationships with others, in our relationship with the creation overall, because of our relationship with God. And so there's a number of different references which are made in that regard in the Quran. Overall, the Islam revelation itself is governed by objectives. And those objectives we find are the value of these principles that teach us where harm and benefit is at. That's deen itself. And making sure that we have that as a value which is preserved in our life. Yani hifdul deen. And then we have, or maqsad hifdul deen. That's one of the points of revelation. That revelation comes to ensure that for humanity in this time period, with the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that preserved for humanity is a way for them to understand what's beneficial, what's harmful, what's the meaning of life, what is their role in this existence and in their lives. Along with that is the issue of preservation of life, human life, without discrimination. Preservation of human life. Revelation comes to teach us the value of life itself, of the human being. Preservation of the development of that human being at the level of intellect really is an indication to the development of that human being overall. So revelation comes to elevate the status of the human being by teaching that human being how to believe in those things which will preserve human dignity, human life, human standing, bring about justice, and so on and so forth. So we see this is one of the reasons why Islam focuses on the idea of preservation of the intellect and preservation of life and preservation of the dignity of the human being. And up to this point, we find that revelation itself is preserving humanity. Revelation itself commands us to preserve humanity. Revelation itself commands us to respect human dignity. Revelation itself commands us to respect reason and intellect, right? As well as wealth, as well as family, as being the means by which humanity continues in existence. So those are some of the basic objectives of revelation, so that we can understand that when we deal with people, this is a common ground that we have, with people overall, that we have to have some values to determine what's just, was harmful, was beneficial. And for us, the key in that regard is the teachings of Islam, but we, because of the teachings of Islam, can see eye to eye with others when they have similar teachings on those issues in which there's common ground on. And we definitely are obligated in Islam to respect human life and human dignity and the development of all which advances the intellect and preserves the intellect. So all of that is common ground that we can have with anyone that exists on the face of the earth. Family, the same thing. The issue of the preservation of family and economy. You know, the wealth of people is considered to be safeguarded. And so society, all of those things which put forward society as far as building wealth in a just manner, as far as human dignity being preserved, as far as the development of human beings, as far as the safeguarding of the family, that's all what we can say to be a set of objectives, which gives us an overall framework so that we can understand how it is that we're going to deal with people. So when people align with us in preserving those things, then it's easy for us to align with them, right? More detailed now. As Muslims, we believe in the oneness of God as the creator. So Allah created all of humanity. So we have to acknowledge that all human beings, they have their origin with God. God created them. And if God created them, we're also obligated to deal with people fairly, regardless of what it is that they believe. Because God gives us that example of providing for all of humanity without discrimination, for those that believe and those that don't believe. So as a first principle, we believe in the common origin of humanity, and that's what we have to acknowledge in other people. Their humanity, and their humanity being established by being the creation of God. The second thing is that we shouldn't engage in oppressing other people because of their beliefs. If God can give provision to believer and unbeliever alike, at that basic level, we acknowledge the humanity of others and that they're the creation of Allah, but that people have the freedom to believe or not to believe. And we have a principle in the Quran itself, la ikraha fi din. There's no compulsion in deen. When it comes to matters of believing in the oneness of God and who God is, people have to come into that belief on their own. The other issue is that all prophets came to teach this reality, and prophets came to guide humanity. And so then we have this acknowledgement that even though there may be some things we differ with, especially when it comes to the people of the book, we acknowledge at the core that they believe in the books, even though we believe that there's some distortion. We acknowledge that they believe in the prophets, even though they may not always believe as we believe, as a common ground. Belief in revelation, belief in the existence of God, belief in revelation, belief in the prophets is something that we all have in common. So we have to acknowledge their humanity, we have to acknowledge their dignity, and we have to acknowledge that they meet us at a certain point. They meet us at a certain point. And if they meet us at a certain point, that gives us all the more common ground to dialogue and to coexist. We already said that we believe in the universal dignity of humanity, right? And we believe in treating people fairly, right? Justly. And so that's something that is, a Quranic teaching in and of itself. The sanctity of life itself is enshrined in the Quran, its existence and the dignity of that existence, right? And so the issue of dealing with people has to come from that framework, along with the reality of justice, right? And so we deal with people in society justly, and fairly, and that is at the core of Islamic teachings. Or you who believe, stand out for justice as witnesses to Allah, and even against yourselves or your parents or your relatives, and whether it be against rich or poor, right? O you who believe, stand out firmly for Allah as witnesses to fair dealing, and let not the hatred of others to you, how they deal with you, make you swerve to wrong and depart from justice. Be just, that is next to realizing piety and fear of Allah, for Allah is well acquainted with all that you do, right? And so when we deal with people on those terms, right? We deal with people on those terms. So that brings us to the reality that if the Quran commands us to justice, and if there's some levels at which we can have a common ground with people, and if all human beings have their origin with God, and human beings have been created in dignity, we acknowledge that humanity as a whole is established in a brotherhood of just being human beings, even though they may differ at the level of religion. And so because there's no compulsion in deen, la ikraha fi deen, right? Then at the end of the day, we're obligated to come to know one another. Oh, humankind, we have created you from a single pair, a male and a female, and have made you into nations, communities, and tribes, so that you may come to know one another. Verily, the most honored of you in the sight of God or Allah is the most righteous, the most conscious of God. And so that teaching in the Quran gives us an understanding that humanity has an origin, and the diversity at that level between human beings, different ethnic communities and different languages, that's a diversity that is accepted. Now, when it comes to the matter of belief, we said that we can't force people to come into Islam, right? We can't force people to believe what we want them to believe. The boundaries are on the issue of whether people harm us, you know what I'm saying, or don't harm us, whether they harm society or don't harm society, right? And so that's something that is extremely, important to understand. That sharing in goodness with others, there's no issue with that. There's no issue with that. There's no issue in having a relationship with people, as long as it is that they don't violate our rights, as long as it is that they don't impose upon us, we can coexist. That's an important point, the issue, of coexistence. The Quran says, as for such, when it comes to the case of those who don't believe as you believe, non-Muslims, who do not fight you on account of your faith or drive you forth from your homelands, Allah does not forbid you to show them kindness, also love and respect, and to deal with them with equity, with qist, right? For Allah loves those who act equitably. Allah only forbids you to turn in friendship towards those who fight against you because of your faith and drive you forth from your homelands, or aid others in driving you forth from your homelands. As for those from among you who turn toward them for alliance, it is they who are wrongdoing, because they are people who work against peace and stability, and they violate the rights of the believers. So the issue of justice, al-adala or al-adl, is about keeping balance in our relationships. The issue of qist, which the Quran calls us to, is about doing more than just being kind, right? So here, when we look at the reality of qist and bir, the Quran, it teaches us that it's the duty of the Muslim to treat peacefully others and coexist with them in equity in bir. The term bir and what it derives from, as far as the different meanings that we can get from it, are terms used in the Quran and Hadith to refer to one's relationship with his or her parents. Such relationship is more than kindness, since it includes also love and respect, right? And so this is the context in which the Quran calls us to deal with others, because our neighbors have rights over us. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, in the 40 hadith, when he talked about لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه, none of you has completed his or her faith until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. He defined brother here as even the non-Muslim, And this is not a politically correct concept. This is not something that we're making up for the sake of just coexistence. This is actually embedded in the teachings of Islam. And so the idea of the neighbor having rights over us, there's no discrimination in that regard. Again, of course, there's going to be differences between people who they have a certain type of lifestyle. Everybody doesn't have a lifestyle which is necessarily beneficial, but people have goodness, and those people who have goodness and they have clean lifestyles, they're not people of problems and trouble and injustice and so on and so forth. We're more than encouraged to have relationships with those people, coexist with them, because society depends upon that. At the end, we want to close with saying that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent as a mercy for all of humanity, right? And so the command to be merciful applies to all, because we are in imitation of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And lastly, the Quran commands us to the reality of learning how to dialogue, right? We find the Quran tells us, say, O Muslims, O people of the book, come to a common ground or a common term which we and you hold in common, that we shall worship none but Allah, and that we shall not ascribe divinity to any besides him. And so we also find the Quran tells us, yani, idfa billati hiya ahsan, which basically means that the way that we engage people, it should be at the highest level of character and goodness, right? The highest level of character and goodness. Now, that doesn't preclude us or stop us from making sure that we preserve ourselves from the harms of others. But overall, the default position in the Quran is coexistence with people, and to tighten the bonds of community, and to seek out where there's common ground. And in those matters in which we differ, to dialogue those matters so that we can come to an understanding, of where it is that we have common ground and where it is that we don't. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all of our relationship with others that are from the people of the book specifically has to be trying to convince them to come into Islam. No, it has to be, it means that we have to engage justly and fairly with people that we work with, that we live with. But when those times or situations arise where people have questions or doubts with regard to what it is that we believe, we clarify that in the best of manners, and we show where there's common ground. And overall, we see that it's very difficult for us to be able to have stable societies if we don't have a Quranic framework. Sometimes people misunderstand Quranic teachings, and they generalize certain ideas and they apply them to everyone when they shouldn't. But the Quran gives a status specifically to those who believe in God, even though the Quran doesn't compromise on the idea that people may have mistakes in what it is that they believe. That doesn't mean that we have a right to violate the dignity of others. It doesn't mean that we have a right to impose upon others and force others to believe as we believe. But rather, what is established in the Quran is that we deal with people equitably, justly, and we deal with people in a manner in which we can communicate and coexist in matters which we differ in. We dialogue through those issues, even if at the end it means that we part ways. The Quran acknowledges that freedom is at the core. Freedom is at the core when it comes to the issue of belief. But at the same time, belief is something which has to be understood properly, and it has to be something which is presented in the soundest of ways, and it has to be something which appeals to the heart as well as to the intellect, and so on and so forth. So the burden of da'wah falls upon us as Muslims to be able to truly understand our deen. And in this case, we see that the Quranic principles that we find acknowledge that we can coexist with others, and that we should enter into dialogue with others, not only in matters where we differ in faith, but also on how to build a better life, a better set of conditions for our lives, because it is the case that we live in pluralistic societies. That's a Quranic imperative. With that, we end. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.